Let's continue on then. There are some additional things that I put on the website to help you that I thought might be of some benefit. The first one is a text called Death and Dying in the Tibetan Buddhist Tradition. And it was compiled by Venerable Pandey Hatter. And this one begins talking about contemplation and meditation on death and impermanence, and of course that's an important part of the practice in the Nindro, the common Nindro part of that. It's included in the common Nindro prayer in our prayer book. We start out, whenever we do that, we go through it rather quickly so we don't spend a lot of time contemplating it. But it's the kind of thing that we need to periodically reflect on a little bit more, even though we may have completed our Nindro practices. Just being aware that we don't know when it's going to happen. It could happen at any time. Our state of mind at death is also very important. It affects our future lives, and so the state of mind that we are in, since we don't know when that's going to happen, it's good to keep an open and peaceful mind all the time, so that regardless of when it happens, we're ready for it in that regard. Also, having no regrets or fears allow us to die in a state of the greatest bliss. It says here that the best, the people who practice the best, the abilities to die in this great state of bliss. The mediocre will die happily. The initial practitioner will have neither fear nor dread of the death. So at least being a practitioner is helpful regardless of our particular level. Two common meditations in the Tibetan tradition. The first one looks at the certainty and imminence of death and what will benefit at the time of death as a motivation. And the second one is a simulation or rehearsal for the actual death process. So it familiarizes us with that. And it can also involve going to a cemetery or a burial ground to contemplate on death and become familiar with that. So a lot of times chud practice is actually done in a cemetery. In the West, we have kind of nice cemeteries compared to the charnel grounds that they refer to, where dead bodies were just dumped. So it's a much different kind of an experience there. But just being in the presence of people who have died in that sense, I think, can be have an effect on us in a way that can be helpful with regard to looking at our own death. And then he talks here about what he calls the 9-round death meditation. So we contemplate the 3 roots and the 9 reasonings and the 3 convictions, which are described here. The first is that death is certain. So there's no way to get out of it. We know that always is the result. We don't know when it's going to happen. The second one is the time of death is uncertain. So we don't know how long we're going to live. We may be young, old, we may be healthy or sick. There may be many causes or circumstances. Weakness and frailty may contribute to that. It can be a disease, it could be an accident, it could be other kinds of disasters. The third one is the only thing that can help us at the time of death is our mental, spiritual development. So being prepared. Everything we do is preparation. This is kind of like plan B, if you will. So worldly possessions like wealth, possessions, money can't help. Relatives and friends can't help. Even our own precious body is no help. The second meditation that it referred to then is the one related to simulating. So you're imagining going through the death process, if you will. So it involves knowing what the stages of the death and mind-body relationship are, and the winds dissolving, and we've talked about these various stages, but we never really talked about that as a specific practice per se, or at least haven't very often talked about it as a specific practice. So you literally visualize going through these different stages as a part of that. and then this small p, the indestructible drop at the heart with a white top and a red bottom, called the indestructible drop, which lasts until the time of death. And the very subtle life-bearing wind dwells inside that, and at death all winds ultimately dissolve into it. And so we visualize that process of the dissolution of our senses and the outer elements and so forth, where we go through the process of seeing like a mirage and smoke and sparks and the light, and then that going into the white, kind of like a white sky. Everything turns kind of white, and then the red, as the white drop descends and the red drop ascends, and then they meet together, everything goes black. And then there's this stirring of the life wind inside that then results in the appearance of the clear light. So death begins with a sequential dissolution of the winds associated with the four elements, earth associated with the hard things in the body, no longer capable of serving as a mount, the water, the liquid factors of the body, those dissolve. And there's actually a set of charts in here that go through all of these, and it's a fairly complete set. It has the factors that are dissolving, it has the external signs and the internal signs. The ones I just went through are the internal signs, but there are multiple ones because there are multiple factors that are going through this dissolution practice, not just the elements associated with it. So that is a handy thing to have, that set of charts and the various cycles through which all of that goes. There's 8 different cycles that are listed there. And then, okay, it's still going through here, the different cycles. Some other signs, it says when all heat has left the area of the heart, the body starts to smell or decompose. A subtle awareness that consciousness has left the body, has become just like an empty shell. Excuse me. A slumping of the body, if they're sitting in a meditation posture, would be an indication after the breath has stopped. Buddhists generally prefer the body not be removed before one or more of these signs occur. It may disturb the end process of death, since the death process is considered to extend beyond what we normally consider to be life in the Western point of view. Ideally, we want to have things left still for a longer period of time. When the clear light vision ceases, consciousness leaves the body. We have the stages of dissolution in reverse order then. Okay, so we go through these in the reverse order, and we're reborn into the intermediate state, the bardo, with a subtle body. Then the intermediate state can last from just a moment to 7 days in this description. And we've talked about that before, that in some ways of doing this, it's a set of 7 days and then 7 sets of 7 days that make the 49 days that are described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So if we do not have what is called the small death, then we again experience this. So we go through a second intermediate state, and this can happen for a total of 7 rebirths in the intermediate state, or a total of 49 days. So these states of increasing subtlety, so it doesn't just repeat itself, but they become more and more subtle each cycle that we go through here, and of increasing grossness during rebirth, are also experienced in the fainting and orgasm, as well as before and after sleeping and dreaming, although not in a complete form. And give us a little bit of a hint of what that might be like. This great subtlety and clarity of mind during the death process also makes it valuable to use for advanced meditation practices. Advanced practitioners will often stay in the clear light meditation for several days after the breathing has stopped and can achieve liberation at this time. And we've talked about if you recognize the clear light, then you achieve liberation. And it is said that the longer we can stay in that clear light, or Rigpa, if you will, then the longer that experience of clear light in the death process is going to last. So that gives us some motivation to work on trying to be able to sustain that as we do our daily practice in this lifetime. It also brings with it karmic imprints or potentialities from the next life, and those can ripen at any time in the future when conditions are suitable. So the Alaya consciousness, when that comes over, has those described as seeds of karma, and when the right conditions come up, then they manifest and affect our lives, good, bad, or indifferent. Rebirth is then propelled by karma. The effect of karma of the intermediate state matches that of future parents. So if the parents are going to have a certain effect on us in our development that can cause certain things, then there's a tie-in to the karma there. The illusory appearance of the parents copulating, and we're drawn to this by the force of attraction to the parent of the opposite sex. This desire causes the consciousness of the intermediate state to enter the fertilized ovum, the egg. One will not necessarily be reborn as a human being, and it talks a little bit about the 6 realms, but all 6 levels are ultimately in the nature of suffering. So they're usually linked to one particular kind of suffering, but we can have all kinds of sufferings regardless of the particular realm. It's just that one of them tends to be dominant. The state of mind at the time of death is regarded as extremely important because this plays a vital part in the situation one is born into. Mind of the person who commits suicide is usually depressed and negative and is likely to throw them into a lower rebirth. So spiritual care of the dying is described a little bit here. It gives several categories depending on whether they're conscious or unconscious, have a religious belief or not. If the person is conscious and they can do practices themselves or somebody can assist them, then they should do that. If they are unconscious, someone has to do it for them, which is kind of what I was describing a little bit earlier. If a person has specific religious beliefs, these can also be utilized to help them. If they do not, they still need to be encouraged to have positive and virtuous thoughts at the time of death, reminding them of the positive things they have done during their life. So for a spiritual practitioner, encourage them to have thoughts such as love, compassion, and remembering their spiritual teacher. It's also helpful to have an image in the room there for them related to their practices. Say some prayers, recite mantras, silent or aloud, whatever seems the most appropriate for them. However, he says here that we should be sensitive to the needs of the dying person. The most important thing to keep in mind is keeping the person calm and happy. So in one of the previous things we looked at, we didn't want people crying or screaming or other kinds of things that could cause discomfort for the dying person. They say here it's good to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but if he or she is not familiar with particular deities and practices contained in it, then this is not likely to prove very beneficial. And I think that that's generally true of these various practices. If somebody has never done Poa before, they're not familiar with that, and especially if they really aren't Buddhist at all, then that kind of thing could be more complicated for them. So generally speaking, I can do prayers and things of general nature for people who've died like that, but unless they have a Buddhist background or specifically have requested something like that, then I generally prefer not to do that kind of a practice for somebody who's not Buddhist, because I think it could be harmful for them. It is best not to disturb the dying person with noise or shows of emotion. Attachment and clinging can disturb the mind. It's more helpful to mentally let the person go, to encourage them to move on to the next life without fear. It is important not to deny death or to push it away, just to be with the dying person as fully and openly as possible, trying to have an open and deep sharing of the person's fear, pain, joy, love, etc. Silent communication and prayer might be helpful. It is not necessary to talk much. It can be encouraged to let go into the light and so forth. Again, either verbal or mental. So those, I think, are helpful practices. Sogyal Rinpoche's book on the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, the second half of that book has a lot of helpful suggestions in there, both for Buddhists and non-Buddhists, that you might consider as well. It can be very helpful to encourage the dying person to use breathing meditation. Helps develop calmness and help with pain control, acceptance, removing fear. It can help the dying person get in touch with their inner stillness and peace and come to terms with their death. It can be useful to combine those with mantra, prayer, and so forth, especially if the person is familiar with those things. Sogyal Rinpoche says it takes up to 21 days on average for the person that is more connected to a previous life to continue silent communication with that person, to say goodbyes, finish any unfinished business, reassure the dead person, encourage them to let go of their old life and move on to the next one. And for more adept practitioners, doing the transference of consciousness. Another thing related to that, you can rub or tap the area gently or pull the crown hair after the person dies. That's said to be the first place that should be touched on the person after they die. That helps direct their consciousness upward and potentially then outward in the POA practice. There are also special blessed pills called POA pills that can be placed on the crown after death, which also facilitates the process. I'm not familiar with any of those specifically. Once the consciousness has left the body, which can take up to 3 days, it doesn't matter how the body is disposed of or handled. Throw them in the trash bin. Now, usually we want to do it in a different form than that, but it's basically an empty shell at that point. The consciousness is left, and so it can be disposed of at that time, whether cremation or whatever approach that the person left for their wishes for how to dispose of that. But one of the questions that sometimes comes up that he talks about here is organ donation. So his recommendation is that if it's motivation but of compassion, because usually the organs have to be removed immediately, which is a way that would potentially disturb the consciousness, disturb the body of the individual. And that's the source of the problem. But he says he thinks that the positive karma created through that action would outweigh the disturbance caused through the process of the organs being removed from the body. And so I think it's the kind of thing that we have to take up individually. If you think you might be disturbed by that, then maybe that wouldn't be a good thing to do. But if you think, well, it's just a shell of a body that time, there's my consciousness, so I feel confident that I'll recognize the clear light, and so forth, then you may want to go ahead and make an organ donation as a part of that. One of the things that is sometimes done in Tibet is the sky burial. And the sky burial, the body is chopped up and given to the vultures or other birds, and it's done as a last act of bodhicitta, of a giving, a donation or an offering to the birds, which kind of a noble act, if you will, because it's not of any use to anybody else at that point. Of course, they couldn't bury people very well there. If they buried them, they mostly had to do it by covering them with dirt rather than digging a hole, because the ground is frozen most of the year. And so sky burial became an alternative way to doing that. But cremation, although if you've seen pictures of Tibet, there's not a lot of trees in a lot of the area in Tibet, so they don't really have wood for doing cremations either. So you can see why something like sky burial would come about through that. So another thing that he discusses here is that that's becoming more popular in the West is to get part of the remains of the deceased, ashes, hair, nails, and so forth, blessed, and then put into statues or tsatsas or stupas, that kind of thing. I actually have something like that in my will to put them into a statue. So these could be kept in a person's home, it could be in a memorial garden, it could be making offerings to these or circumambulating them is regarded as a highly meritorious for both the person who died and or for the loved ones. So there are also rituals for guiding the person and the dead in other sources, including the ritual of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So this is just a helpful guide about some of the practices as they are done in Tibet, to provide some guidance to us in figuring out how to do these things and what we may or may not choose to do as a part of this. Another one that I ran across that I think could be very helpful is funeral advice for Buddhists, according to the Tibetan tradition. And so if we are not prepared, death can be a confusing and terrifying experience, but with preparation it can be an opportunity for attaining higher rebirth or even enlightenment. The traditional practices performed for the dying person, some of the main points to consider is when we're dying or accompanying somebody who's dying, things like organ donation we just talked about, typical funeral service, and storing cremated remains. There are some enclosed documents here. There's one for nurses and another for the funeral home, the undertakers, to give them some guidance related to the Buddhist practices, suggestions for them on what to do or not do. There's a section on prayers. In Tibet, the tradition is to ask the local lama to come to the bedside of the deceased and perform prayers 3 times a day until auspicious date for a sky burial. Thereafter, the family would sponsor prayers and food at the local monasteries for 49 days, sometimes giving 1/3 of their wealth to ensure spiritual well-being for their relatives. So this could be a very expensive proposition for people to do this. Here in the West, the following approach is emerging: prayers from a suitably qualified practitioner, which doesn't need to be a lama, it could be any spiritual friend. Where possible, at the bedside, prayers from lineage holders are requested where there's a strong link, accompanied by a donation plus any expenses. Prayers may include poa, a short bardo prayer, a confession to the 35 Buddhas, chud, Amitabha, the long Amitabha Puja on the 49th day, and those to the deceased may also want to read daily from the Bardo Todal. The Simple Practices document on page 5 is designed to be used to everyone regardless of their level or experience. Some main points to take into consideration: ideally have a peaceful environment with loving thoughts for fellow beings. It's not always possible, but is strongly advised to keep that the bedside be kept quiet and the mind be as drug-free, clear, and aware as possible. If somebody's in a great deal of pain, sometimes they will be put on drugs that can cloud the mind, and so there's a trade-off there between keeping the mind as clear as possible and the degree of pain that the person is experiencing at the time. So you have to kind of weigh that back and forth. However, there should be no sense of failure if this isn't possible. The person who is dying and those accompanying them need as much stability of mind as possible. You shouldn't agitate the dying person or disturb them from attending to their death mindfully. And then, while still conscious and able to practice, keep one's root guru clearly in mind, or one's teacher to whom one has great devotion. Also, do one's usual, most familiar practice is beneficial. As soon as the dying process has begun, a family member or friend who is able to be calm and compassionate should sit at the bedside and speak gently along the lines of, "Don't be afraid. Whatever appears, it's only a projection of your mind like a dream. There's nothing to fear. Just relax. And when a bright light appears, bright white light appears, go toward it, merge with it." And then Tonglen practice can be done. There are other simple practices that can be done. If the deceased has a strong connection with the local Buddhist center or teacher, please inform them as soon as possible and request prayers. In general, the body should not be moved or touched unless necessary, so ask those who are caring for the dying person to delay touching or washing the body for 4 hours, if at all possible, and give them the document When a Buddhist Dies for nurses, which is a part of this collection. So, and then there's also some Bardo prayers that are available from their website. And then there's a document that gives some simple practices to do, Chinrezi prayers, reciting the Mani mantra, and so forth, as much as possible, especially during the first 3 days, but also continuing through the 49 days. The best prayers are usually the ones that you do, so ones that you are familiar with, and being able to hear someone else doing those. Tonglen is another practice that they recommend as a part of this. Saying things to the deceased, very similar to the one that I just recited there. Setting aside a few moments daily to talk to the deceased. They should be reassured that even though they may see frightening things, they should recognize these as being merely projections of their own mind, as they no longer have a body and they can no longer be hurt. Light a candle, send blessings and positive thoughts to them, and so forth. The end of each week, the 17th day, 14th, 21st, and so forth, up through the 49th days, are considered to be significant, and some people may choose to light candles or say special prayers on those days. One could also perform virtuous positive acts and dedicate merit to the deceased as a part of that. So doing a particular practice, one it mentions here is Nyungne practice, which is a 1,000-arm Chinrezi practice that's done over a period of 2 days, and then dedicating the merit of that. The information for nurses, it talks about the first 3 days, contacting the person's Buddhist center for prayers to be said if death is known to be close or as soon as possible after death. The ideal is to have the prayers done at the bedside as soon as possible. Leave the body undisturbed for 4 hours. If a doctor has to touch the body to certify death, request that they delay laying out the body until prayers have been said. Once prayers have been said, the body can be laid out and moved. Then the crown should be the first thing touched. And then maintaining a tranquil and compassionate environment. Friends and family may want to sit by the body and pray. If a post-mortem is required, ask for it to be postponed for 33.5 days. And in Arizona, you can actually get dry ice and put on and under the body to help preserve the body. Or if they are sent to one of the funeral homes, you can ask that it be put in cold storage and maintained for that period of time. It says if there's no family, inform social services. The undertaker should just lift the body into the coffin, assuming that you have washed it already. There should be no embalming, and the cremation should take place after 3.5 days. For undertakers, the information is basically the same about that. The body does not need to be, if the body does not need to be washed, then do whatever is just the minimum. Refrigerate rather than embalm. Speedy completion of cremation forms is appreciated. The cremation burial should not take place until 3.5 days have elapsed. There is another set of practices on the website, Death and Dying, Heart Practices and Advice. This comes from FPMT organization, and so there are links. I didn't print out all of the materials that they had for that, but I did add a list of things to the list that's actually on their website. They have a list of links, and so within that, for example, the 8 prayers to benefit the dead, I actually listed the 8 prayers on what I put on our website. Or the 10 powerful mantras for the time of death, I put a list of what those 10 mantras are, and so forth. And so there's a number of things there. I thought that I would just mention a few of those. Well, the main things that it talks about are the Medicine Buddha Puja, the wish-fulfilling jewel, the 8 prayers to benefit the dead, the additional practices for the benefit of the dead, 10 powerful mantras that I mentioned, the mantras to place on a dead body, practicing 5 powers near the time of death, and then the Rinchen Silktor verse, which is the thing that he says should be done as the very first thing, which I did copy. It's just a very short verse. The verse says, "To the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected full body, awakened being, having a jeweled ushnisha, I prostrate." Ushnisha is the bun, or sometimes it's referred to as the little protrusion on the top of the head. So that's a very short verse that can be said for the individual as a part of that. And there's a little bit of an explanation in there. The practices to cultivate the dead or benefit the dead, this is according to Lama Zopa Rinpoche. The Medicine Buddha Puja that I mentioned before, this is basically a list. There's some additional ones, though, that are not on that list. Vajrasattva Tsok, thousands of light offerings. You can light lots of candles or water bowls, flowers, and so forth. The Nyingna practice we mentioned before. Vajrasattva retreat or Chenrezi retreat, Medicine Buddha retreat, or all of them. Tonglen, together with Om Mani Padme Hung recitations, dedicating the merit to the person who died. Reciting various prayers, the Vajrakutter Sutra, the Heart Sutra. Meditate on emptiness, dedicating again the merit, either for a day or a weekend group retreat. Performing Dorje Khandro fire puja. Making stupas or tsatsas, that was mentioned in another one, making tankas or statues that are dedicated for the person's good rebirth, publishing Dharma, paying for the publishing of Dharma books or sponsoring them being published. If the person who has died practiced Tantra, then performing the self-initiation and soak offering of the person's main deity, or a weekend retreat to the person's main deity, or making offerings on the person's behalf. It lists a number of ways that can be done as well. So there's quite a few different things. These are the mantras that it mentions as placing on the body of the dead person. So they're all in Tibetan, so those could be done and cut out and put together either in a single thing or maybe put at different points on the body. So that would be the other practice there that is mentioned as a part of that. So there we have it. We have gone through the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the focus on liberation by hearing. We looked at that and some alternative ways of doing that. And then we've looked at a number of other practices that are done in Tibet and are increasingly also being done in the West as a part of the practices for people who have died. And some of those are practices that we can do for ourselves in preparation for our inevitable death, whenever that happens to come. And so I hope those things have been helpful to you. I hope that you will spend some time thinking about those and laying out what your wishes, your plans are, so that at the time, whenever that happens to be, that others will be able to find them and help you with that process. So that concludes our Tibetan Book of the Dead class.